Rediscover your past by digitizing your family's memories with LEGACYBOX. Watch until the end of this video to find out more about preserving your legacy, and then visit legacybox.com/recollection. In 1941, the United States had a population of 133 million people, and the mood of the country was shifting fast. What began as a year of speeches and warnings would end on a single morning in Hawaii. News carried the tension, but most Americans still didn't realize how close the war truly was. This is the year 1941. On January 6th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered his famous Four Freedoms speech during the State of the Union address, defining four essential human rights: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, a moral framework that helped prepare the nation for a larger role in the global conflict. January 16th brought a stark warning from U.S. Vice Admiral Patrick Bellinger and Army Air Corps Major General Frederick Martin as they issued a notice predicting a possible surprise early morning assault on Pearl Harbor. Their alert was not heeded, and it did not lead to full defensive readiness. On January 23rd, famed aviator Charles Lindbergh testified before Congress, urging neutrality and suggesting the United States negotiate with Nazi Germany, a controversial stance that reflected strong isolationist sentiment still present in the country. February 4th marked the founding of the United Service Organizations, better known as the USO. The organization was created to provide entertainment and morale support to American service members at home and abroad. Signed into law on March 11th, the Lend-Lease Act allowed FDR to send weapons, food, and supplies to allied nations, especially Great Britain, without immediate payment. The act also secured vital U.S. long-term military base leases in British territories. March 22nd saw recent Oscar-winning actor Jimmy Stewart enlist in the U.S. Army, becoming the first major movie star to serve in uniform during World War II. On May 1st, General Mills introduced its oat cereal, Cheerios. Later, it would be renamed Cheerios and go on to become one of the best-selling breakfast cereals in American history. That same day, U.S. savings bonds went on sale to help finance defense spending, encouraging ordinary citizens to support war efforts financially. Premiering on May 1st was the groundbreaking film Citizen Kane, directed by and starring Orson Welles. It debuted in New York City and would later be widely regarded as one of the greatest films ever made for its storytelling and technical innovation. On May 27th, FDR declared a national emergency after a German U-boat sank the American ship Robin Moore in the Atlantic, increasing public awareness that the war was already affecting U.S. vessels. May 31st saw the first issue of Parade magazine hit newsstands, eventually becoming one of the most widely read Sunday supplements in the country. On June 2nd, baseball legend Lou Gehrig died from ALS, the progressive nerve disease that would become widely known as Lou Gehrig's disease. He had been diagnosed just 2 years earlier. June 16th was the day when Washington National Airport, the first federally owned airport, opened near Washington, D.C. June 22nd changed the course of the war as Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa and invaded the Soviet Union, the largest land invasion in history, opening up the brutal Eastern Front. July 1st introduced television advertising to the masses when Bulova aired the first paid TV commercial, a simple on-screen clock during a baseball broadcast. On July 17th, Joe DiMaggio's legendary 56-game hitting streak ended in Cleveland, a record that still stands as one of baseball's most unbreakable achievements. August 14th brought a joint declaration from FDR and Winston Churchill, known as the Atlantic Charter. This outlined shared war aims and principles for a post-war world. Construction began on September 11th on the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, destined to become the headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense. On October 9th, FDR approved early atomic research funding, a decision that would grow into the Manhattan Project, and ultimately produce the first atomic bombs. Beginning on October 11th, the Fall River, Massachusetts Firestone plant was destroyed by a fire, wiping out a huge rubber supply and hindering military production. October 31st marked the completion of Mount Rushmore, ending years of carving work on the presidential monument in South Dakota. On December 7th at 7:55 a.m., Japanese forces launched a surprise air attack on Pearl Harbor, crippling much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet and killing over 2,400 Americans, an event that brought the United States directly into World War II. On December 8th, the United States and Britain formally declared war on Japan, and the U.S. officially entered World War II. On Christmas Day, a future holiday classic was introduced when Bing Crosby first performed the song White Christmas on radio. The song would go on to become the best-selling single of all time. December 26th closed the year with a historic speech as Winston Churchill became the first British Prime Minister to address a joint session of the U.S. Congress, warning that the Axis powers would stop at nothing. By 1942, the United States had grown to roughly 134 million people, and we were fully at war. Ration books sat in kitchen drawers, and blackout curtains covered windows, while radios carried news from distant battlefields. It was a year of sacrifice, full of turning points that would permanently alter the course of history. January 1st unified the Allied cause when President FDR and Prime Minister Winston Churchill joined representatives of 26 nations in signing the Declaration by United Nations. They devoted their full military and economic resources to defeating the Axis powers. On January 16th, actress Carole Lombard and her mother were among 22 killed when TWA Flight 3 crashed into a mountain near Las Vegas. Lombard had just completed a successful war bond tour, raising millions for the war effort, and her death shocked both Hollywood and the American people. January 26 saw the first American troops arrive in Northern Ireland, marking the beginning of a sustained U.S. military presence in Europe. The arrival strengthened British defenses and signaled that American forces would soon play a direct role on the continent. February 8th ushered in daylight saving time, a change implemented year-round to conserve fuel and electricity. It was one of many small adjustments Americans made as the war reshaped daily routines. On February 10th, bandleader Glenn Miller received the first ever gold record for selling 1 million copies of Chattanooga Choo Choo. At a time when uncertainty filled headlines, swing music offered energy, optimism, and a sense of normalcy. February 18th brought tragedy off the coast of Newfoundland when the USS Truxtun and USS Pollux ran aground during a brutal storm. More than 200 sailors lost their lives in freezing conditions, a reminder that the Atlantic theater carried deadly risks even far from major battles. February 19th remains one of the most controversial decisions of the war, as Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. The order authorized the forced relocation of over 110,000 Japanese Americans, most of them U.S. citizens, into internment camps. On February 22nd, General Douglas MacArthur was ordered to leave the Philippines as Japanese forces overwhelmed American defenses. Escaping to Australia, he famously vowed, "I shall return," a promise that would become central to Allied strategy in the Pacific. February 24th brought confusion and fear to Los Angeles during the so-called Battle of Los Angeles, when anti-aircraft batteries fired into the night sky at what proved to be a false alarm. March 18th quietly challenged baseball's color barrier when Jackie Robinson and Nate Moreland requested a tryout with the Chicago White Sox. Though no contract followed, the moment foreshadowed Robinson's eventual breakthrough into Major League Baseball 5 years later. April 18th marked a daring retaliation as Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 B-25 bombers in a surprise raid on Tokyo. Though the physical damage was limited, the Doolittle raid delivered a powerful morale boost to Americans and forced Japan to rethink its defensive strategy. May 6th ended organized U.S. resistance in the Philippines when Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright surrendered remaining forces. Thousands of Americans and Filipino troops were taken prisoner, many enduring harsh captivity for years. On May 20th, the first African American was officially accepted into the U.S. Navy, in a role beyond the mess hall. Though still segregated, the move represented a gradual shift toward broader military inclusion. Beginning on June 4th and lasting 3 days, the Battle of Midway became a decisive turning point in the Pacific. U.S. forces sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, crippling Japan's offensive power and shifting momentum in favor of the Allies. On June 12th, a 13-year-old girl from Amsterdam received a diary as a birthday gift. Within weeks, Anne Frank and her family went into hiding to escape Nazi persecution. Her writings in this book would later become one of the most important personal accounts of the Holocaust. On June 25th, Major General Dwight D. Eisenhower assumed command of U.S. forces in Europe. His leadership and diplomatic skill would soon place him at the center of Allied invasion planning. August 7th launched America's first major ground offensive of the war when U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal. The campaign would become a brutal 6-month struggle in jungle terrain, marking a shift from defensive to offensive strategy in the Pacific. August 13th formally accelerated the Manhattan Project, placing General Leslie Groves in charge of the secret program to develop an atomic bomb. Massive facilities would soon rise in Tennessee, Washington State, and New Mexico under extraordinary secrecy. September 9th marked the first air attack on the U.S. mainland during the war, when a Japanese float plane dropped incendiary bombs over an Oregon forest. Though damage was minimal, the symbolic impact underscored that the war had reached American soil. October 23rd saw another air tragedy when Hollywood composer Ralph Ranger was killed in a mid-air collision near Palm Springs. His flight, American Airlines Flight 28, collided with a U.S. Army bomber. November 26th introduced audiences to the film Casablanca, starring Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman. Set against the backdrop of war, its themes of sacrifice and love resonated deeply with wartime audiences. November 28th brought one of the deadliest nightclub disasters in U.S. history, when the Coconut Grove fire in Boston killed 491 people. The tragedy led to sweeping changes in fire safety regulations nationwide. December 2nd delivered a scientific milestone beneath the stands of Stagg Field in Chicago. This is where physicist Enrico Fermi achieved the first self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. Following the success, a coded message was sent to Roosevelt, stating, "The Italian navigator has landed in the New World." And finally, on December 31st, the year ended without a true celebration, as the Times Square Ball was not dropped due to wartime restrictions. Instead, a moment of silence marked midnight, a subdued close to one of the most intense years in American history. By 1943, the United States population had reached roughly 136 million people, and war was raging on in Europe and the Pacific. Factories were producing tanks, aircraft, and ships at astonishing speed, while women filled industrial jobs that men left behind. The year saw both grim sacrifices and crucial turning points as the Allies began gaining momentum against the Axis powers. January 7th marked the passing of brilliant inventor Nikola Tesla, who died of coronary thrombosis at age 86 in a New York hotel room. Tesla's groundbreaking work with alternating current helped shape modern electrical power systems and influence countless technological advances. On January 13th, Nazi leader Adolf Hitler called for total war against the Allies, demanding that Germany mobilize every available resource, industry, manpower, and propaganda in a desperate effort to reverse the war's increasingly unfavorable tide. January 14th saw President Franklin D. Roosevelt fly from Miami to Morocco to meet British Prime Minister Winston Churchill at the Casablanca Conference. It marked the first time a sitting U.S. president traveled overseas by airplane, and the meeting produced the Allied demand for the unconditional surrender of Axis powers. Completed on January 15th, the Pentagon officially became the largest office building in the world, housing the rapidly expanding U.S. military leadership. It took more than 1,000 workers to install the massive air conditioning system required to cool the enormous structure. February 6th was the debut of Frank Sinatra on the popular radio program Your Hit Parade. His smooth voice and romantic style soon sparked nationwide fan hysteria that would become known as Sinatra Mania. On February 11th, U.S. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was selected to command all Allied armies preparing for operations in Europe. The appointment ultimately positioned Eisenhower to lead the future invasion of Normandy. February 13th created the Women's Reserve of the United States Marine Corps, allowing women to take over clerical, communications, and technical duties so male Marines could be deployed to combat roles. On February 15th, artist J. Howard Miller created the famous "We Can Do It" poster for the Westinghouse Electric. Though originally meant for internal wartime morale, the image would later become an enduring symbol of women's empowerment. March 29th saw wartime rationing, as meat, butter, and cheese were limited for Americans. The government used ration books and stamps to ensure supplies reached soldiers overseas while keeping domestic consumption controlled. April 7th brought major changes to professional football, when the National Football League adopted free substitution rules, made helmets mandatory, and approved a standardized 10-game schedule, shaping the modern structure of the sport. April 18th was when Operation Vengeance was carried out by U.S. forces. American P-38 fighters intercepted and shot down the plane carrying Isoroku Yamamoto, the Japanese admiral who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack. May 27th began an extraordinary survival story when Olympic runner Louis Zamperini survived the crash of a B-24 bomber in the Pacific. He drifted for 47 days on a life raft before being captured by Japanese forces and held in brutal prison camps, a story later chronicled in the book Unbroken. May 29th featured artist Norman Rockwell's famous painting, Rosie the Riveter, on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. The image celebrated the millions of women working in factories to support the war effort. Beginning June 3rd, tensions in Los Angeles erupted into the Zoot Suit riots when groups of servicemen attacked young Mexican-American men wearing flamboyant zoot suits. The violence reflected the deep racial tensions and the wartime anxieties in the city. June 9th brought a major change to the U.S. tax system when FDR signed the Current Tax Payment Act, introducing automatic payroll withholding, the system still used to collect federal income taxes today. July 25th marked the downfall of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, who was voted out of power by Italy's Grand Council and then arrested. The dramatic political shift signaled that the Axis alliance was beginning to fracture. August 2nd saw future President John F. Kennedy face wartime danger when his PT-109 boat was rammed and sunk by a Japanese destroyer in the Solomon Islands. Kennedy helped rescue his surviving crew, earning national recognition for his leadership. On August 3rd, U.S. General George Patton slapped a soldier suffering from battle fatigue in a Sicilian field hospital and repeated the act days later on another soldier. The incident sparked public outrage and forced Patton to issue a formal apology. September 3rd brought a major diplomatic shift when Italy secretly signed an armistice with the Allies, agreeing to surrender. The announcement was made public several days later. Italy would ultimately switch sides and join the Allied effort against Germany. On October 7th, the Pacific War took a dark turn when the Japanese ordered the execution of 98 American prisoners of war on Wake Island. October 16th saw Chicago Mayor Edward Kelly open the city's new subway system, expanding public transportation in one of America's largest industrial centers. October 25th introduced the Batman and Robin comic strip to newspapers across the country, bringing the popular comic book characters to an even wider audience. December 1st concluded the Tehran Conference, where Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, and FDR agreed that the long-awaited Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France would take place in May 1944. This operation would become D-Day. On December 4th, racial integration in baseball began, when Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis announced that major league teams were free to sign black players, opening the door to the eventual integration of professional baseball. During the year 1944, the nation was fully committed to winning World War II. The year saw decisive Allied victories, historic legislation at home, and dramatic moments that helped shape the final phase of the war. Even as men were serving and sacrificing overseas, the population of the United States steadily grew to roughly 138 million people. These are the events of the year 1944. On January 31st, leaders from the United States and Britain agreed to postpone the cross-channel invasion into France because there were not yet enough landing craft available for an early May assault. The delay ensured better preparation for what would soon become the historic Normandy invasion. February 3rd saw American forces invade and capture the Marshall Islands, a key Japanese stronghold in the Central Pacific that had long been used as a base for military operations. The victory gave the United States an important staging area for the push toward Japan. On March 2nd, the wartime film Casablanca, starring Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman, won Best Picture at the Academy Awards. The film about love, sacrifice, and resistance in Nazi-controlled Morocco quickly became one of Hollywood's most beloved classics. On May 21st, a tragic accident known as the West Loch disaster struck Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, while munitions were being loaded onto landing ships, preparing for Pacific operations. A massive explosion tore through the harbor's West Loch anchorage. The blast killed at least 160 sailors, injured nearly 400 others, destroyed 6 ships, and heavily damaged nearby piers and buildings. June 6th became one of the most important days of World War II, when 155,000 Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy in northern France, becoming the largest amphibious invasion in history. Despite fierce German resistance, Allied forces established a foothold and began the long campaign that would eventually liberate France and weaken Nazi Germany's grip on Western Europe. On June 10th, 15-year-old pitcher Joe Nuxhall became the youngest player ever to appear in a Major League Baseball game when he took the mound in the 9th inning for the Cincinnati Reds. The St. Louis Cardinals would score 5 runs on 5 walks and 2 hits during the 18-0 loss. June 16th marked a tragic moment in American history when George Stinney Jr., a 14-year-old African-American boy from South Carolina, was executed after being convicted of murdering 2 white girls. His trial lasted only a few hours, and the jury deliberated for less than 10 minutes. On June 22nd, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the GI Bill, officially known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. The landmark legislation provided returning veterans with college tuition, low-interest home loans, and unemployment benefits, helping millions of former soldiers transition to civilian life, and it dramatically expanded the American middle class. On July 6th, disaster struck in Hartford, Connecticut, when a fire erupted under the big top of the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. The flames raced up the paraffin-coated canvas tent, killing 167 people and injuring more than 600. Later that same day, July 6th, future baseball legend Jackie Robinson was arrested at Camp Hood, Texas, after refusing to move to the back of a segregated U.S. Army bus. Robinson was court-martialed, but ultimately acquitted. On July 11th, FDR announced he would seek a fourth term as president. Despite growing concerns about his health, Roosevelt believed continuity in leadership was essential while the nation was still fighting a global war. August 9th introduced one of the most recognizable public service mascots in American history, when the U.S. Forest Service released the first posters featuring Smokey Bear, urging Americans to help prevent forest fires. August 12th saw the death of Joseph Kennedy Jr., the older brother of future President John F. Kennedy. Serving as a Navy pilot on a secret mission in an explosives-laden bomber, Kennedy's aircraft detonated prematurely over England, killing him instantly. On August 25th, Allied and French forces liberated Paris after more than 4 years of Nazi occupation. The following day, Free French leader Charles de Gaulle led a triumphant march as jubilant crowds celebrated the city's liberation. October 8th saw the debut of the radio sitcom The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, starring Ozzie and Harriet Nelson. The wholesome family program later moved to television and became one of the longest-running series in American history. October 20th fulfilled a famous promise when General Douglas MacArthur returned to the Philippines, landing with U.S. forces on the island of Leyte. 2 years earlier, after being forced to leave the islands during the Japanese invasion, MacArthur had vowed, "I shall return." Just 5 days later, on October 25th, during the massive Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japanese forces launched the first organized kamikaze suicide attacks against American warships. The desperate tactic caused serious damage, but also showed how strained Japan's military had become. On November 7th, American voters re-elected Franklin D. Roosevelt, defeating Republican challenger Thomas Dewey. Roosevelt became the only U.S. president ever elected to 4 terms. December 14th saw the release of the film National Velvet, which brought teenage actress Elizabeth Taylor to widespread fame and launched one of Hollywood's most celebrated acting careers. On December 15th, swing band leader Glenn Miller, who was serving in the Army Air Forces, disappeared when the small aircraft carrying him vanished over the English Channel while he was flying to Paris. On December 16th, U.S. Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall became the first American promoted to the new rank of 5-star general. Also on December 16th, German forces launched their last major offensive on the Western Front in what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. The surprise attack created a dangerous bulge in Allied lines and led to some of the fiercest fighting American troops experienced during the war. On December 27th, a labor dispute broke out between President Roosevelt and the popular retailer Montgomery Ward. FDR then ordered the U.S. Army to seize buildings belonging to the company after they refused to comply with a government-approved labor agreement. The move reflected the government's determination to prevent strikes or disruptions that might slow wartime production. 1945 was a year of sacrifice that would pay off by the end. The United States had grown to 140 million people, and for Americans, there was still much uncertainty. Wars in Europe and in the Pacific raged on, but the Allied forces were advancing on Germany and Japan. The year would see many changes, including the loss of a president. These are the events of 1945. On January 8th, the University of Kentucky Wildcats set an NCAA basketball record by holding Arkansas State to just 6 points in a lopsided 75-6 victory. This is a mark that still stands as one of the most dominant performances in college basketball history. Just days later, on January 20th, Franklin D. Roosevelt was sworn in for an unprecedented 4th term as president. By January 25th, the city of Grand Rapids, Michigan, became the first in the nation to add fluoride to its public water supply, beginning a nationwide effort to improve dental health. February 4th was the date when FDR, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin met at the Yalta Conference to discuss how the war would hopefully end and how the world would be divided up afterward. Beginning on February 13th, Allied forces launched a devastating bombing campaign on Dresden in Germany, creating a massive firestorm that destroyed much of the city and killed tens of thousands of civilians. On February 23rd, U.S. Marines raised the American flag during the Battle of Iwo Jima, a moment captured in an iconic photograph that would come to symbolize the war effort. On March 6th, an inventor from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, named George Nissen, received a patent for the modern-day trampoline, a simple idea that would later become a staple of sports and recreation. March 23rd was the beginning of the Battle of Okinawa, as U.S. forces bombarded the island ahead of the invasion, leading to one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific Theater. On March 29th, movie star Jimmy Stewart, who was serving in the war, was promoted to a full colonel. He was one of the few Americans to enlist as a private and rise to the rank of a decorated officer within just 4 years. On the day of April 12th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was at the Little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia. While he was sitting for a painted portrait, he had a stroke and died of a cerebral hemorrhage. Vice President Harry S. Truman was sworn in later that same day. On April 22nd, as Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin, Adolf Hitler reportedly flew into a rage after learning a counterattack had failed. He then acknowledged that Germany had lost the war. Just days later, on April 28th, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini and his companion Clara Petacci were captured and executed by Italian partisans while they were attempting to flee. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler died by suicide in his Berlin bunker. He was alongside his wife of one day, Eva Braun, and this marked the collapse of Nazi leadership as Soviet troops seized the city. Victory in Europe was declared on May 8th, known as Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day. Celebrations erupted across Allied nations following Germany's surrender. On June 20th, U.S. officials approved the transfer of German rocket scientist Wernher von Braun to America, part of a secret effort dubbed Operation Paperclip that would later influence America's race to the moon. A tragic accident occurred on July 28th when a U.S. Army plane crashed into the Empire State Building in New York City during heavy fog, killing 14 people. Just 2 days later, on July 30th, the USS Indianapolis was sunk by a Japanese submarine, leading to one of the worst naval disasters in U.S. history, with many survivors of the disaster lost to shark attacks as they drifted in the water. 300 crew members went down with the ship, 900 survived and went into the water, but only 316 were rescued 5 days later. On August 6th, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima in Japan. The bomb was delivered by a B-29 named the Enola Gay, and the explosion unleashed unprecedented destruction. Three days later, on August 9th, a second U.S. atomic bomb struck Nagasaki, Japan. This accelerated Japan's decision that their chance of winning the war was lost. World War II officially came to an end on September 2nd, when Japan formally surrendered aboard the USS Missouri, a day remembered as Victory over Japan Day. On October 3rd, a young Elvis Presley made his first public appearance at age 10 in Tupelo, Mississippi, at the fair. He stood on a chair and sang Old Shep, winning 5th place and $5 in ride tickets. By October 8th, Raytheon engineer and inventor Percy Spencer applied for a patent that would lead to the development of the microwave oven. The very first radar range would follow the next year. The Nuremberg trials began on November 20th, as leading Nazi officials were brought to justice for war crimes in a historic international tribunal. On December 5th, 5 U.S. Navy planes, known as Flight 19, vanished during a training mission out of Florida. They became one of the most enduring mysteries associated with the Bermuda Triangle. Lastly, on December 21st, General George Patton died from injuries sustained in a car accident as he rode in a Cadillac limousine in Germany. He was on his way to hunt pheasants when his car crashed into an army vehicle. 1946 was a new beginning in the United States, with the war finally over. The population was just over 141 million people, and peace didn't mean slowing down, it meant acceleration. Americans, it seemed, were catching up on lost time. Technology leapt forward. Culture began to shift, and the first clear signs of the Cold War with the Soviets took shape. On January 10th, scientists working on Project Diana successfully bounced radar waves off the moon, proving that communication with objects in space was possible. This achievement quietly opened the door to what we would come to know as the space age. By January 30th, the first U.S. dime honoring Franklin D. Roosevelt entered circulation. It was a tribute to the late president and his connection to the March of Dimes campaign. In a speech delivered on March 5th, Winston Churchill warned that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, a phrase that would come to define the growing divide between East and West. On March 7th, residents of Bikini Atoll were evacuated by the U.S. government to make way for nuclear weapons testing, marking the beginning of a controversial chapter in atomic history. Disaster struck on April 1st when an undersea earthquake off Alaska triggered a massive tsunami that swept across the Pacific, killing 159 people in Hawaii, and it exposed the need for a better warning system. By May 17th, President Harry Truman took the unusual step of seizing control of the nation's railroads in order to prevent a crippling labor strike during a fragile post-war economy. On May 21st, physicist Louis Slotin was exposed to a fatal dose of radiation from a nuclear fission accident at Los Alamos. His death 9 days later ended all hands-on assembly of nuclear cores. On June 14th, Nat King Cole recorded the Christmas song for the first time. This is a tune that would go on to become a holiday classic for generations to come. The atomic age continued on July 1st, when the United States launched Operation Crossroads with a powerful nuclear detonation over Bikini Atoll, the fourth atomic explosion ever conducted. On July 25th, comedy legends Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis performed together in Atlantic City. This was the first time, beginning one of the most famous partnerships in entertainment history. Opening its gates on August 3rd was Santa Claus Land in Santa Claus, Indiana. This became America's very first theme park, years before Disneyland would redefine the concept. By October 9th, the first GE automatic electric blankets hit the market, offering a modern convenience that quickly became a household staple. Despite early concerns over safety, the blankets retailed for $39.50. On October 16th, 10 high-ranking Nazi officials were executed in Germany, following the trials at Nuremberg. This brought a measure of justice following the end of World War II. Basketball history was made on November 1st, when the New York Knickerbockers defeated the Toronto Huskies in the very first game of the Basketball Association of America, the league that would later become the NBA. On November 5th, a young John F. Kennedy was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from the state of Massachusetts, marking the beginning of a political career that would shape a generation. By December 12th, Tide laundry detergent was introduced to American households, ushering in a new era of synthetic cleaning products. Just days later, on December 20th, the film It's a Wonderful Life premiered in New York. The film was considered a failure at the box office and wouldn't become a beloved holiday classic until the 1970s. On December 26th, Mobster Bugsy Siegel opened the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas. This laid the foundation for the city's future as a gambling and entertainment capital. And finally, on December 31st, President Harry S. Truman officially declared an end to World War II, closing the final chapter on a conflict that had reshaped the world. By 1947, the United States population had grown to 144 million people, and everyone was settling into a strange new era. The war had just ended, but communist tensions were rising, adding a new threat to democracy in America. These are the events of the year 1947. On January 15th, the brutalized body of Elizabeth Short, later known as the Black Dahlia, was discovered in Los Angeles, a grisly unsolved murder that would haunt the public for decades. Just 10 days later, on January 25th, notorious gangster Al Capone died in Florida from complications of syphilis, marking the end of the most infamous gangster in American history. In New York City on February 21st, the founder of Polaroid, Edwin Land, demonstrated the first instant camera, the Land Camera Model 95, allowing photos to be developed in minutes. This was a revolutionary step in photography, and it would go on sale the next year. On March 12th, President Harry S. Truman addressed Congress and introduced what became known as the Truman Doctrine, pledging support to nations resisting communism and effectively signaling the start of the Cold War. April 7th brought sad news with the passing of automotive titan Henry Ford. He died at age 83 from a cerebral hemorrhage, leaving behind a legacy that transformed modern industry. History was made on April 15th, when Jackie Robinson stepped onto the field for the Brooklyn Dodgers, breaking Major League Baseball's color barrier and forever changing the sport. Disaster struck on April 16th, when a massive explosion aboard the freighter Grand Camp in Texas City, Texas, killed nearly 600 people, making it one of the deadliest industrial accidents in U.S. history. On April 19th, President Harry Truman officially opened the first White House bowling alley, a small but memorable addition to the West Wing. April 30th was the day that the Boulder Dam was officially renamed the Hoover Dam in honor of former President Herbert Hoover. On May 11th, the B.F. Goodrich Company announced the development of the tubeless tire, an innovation that would improve automobile safety and performance. In a major policy shift on June 5th, Secretary of State George C. Marshall unveiled the Marshall Plan, a massive effort designed to rebuild war-torn Western Europe, revive its industrialization, and counter the spread of Soviet communism. Released on June 11th, the film Miracle on 34th Street debuted in theaters, eventually becoming one of the most beloved Christmas movies of all time. On July 7th, reports began to emerge of a mysterious crash near Roswell, New Mexico. This event sparked belief in the existence of extraterrestrial life, and also became the basis for UFO conspiracy theories. On July 18th, Florence Blanchfield became the first woman to hold permanent military rank in U.S. history when she was appointed a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. By August 23rd, the first Little League World Series championship was played in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, marking the beginning of what would become a global youth sports tradition. A sweeping reorganization took effect on September 18th, with the passage of the National Security Act of 1947. This act created the Department of Defense, the CIA, and the National Security Council. It also established the Air Force as its own branch of the military. On September 30th, the New York Yankees defeated the Brooklyn Dodgers in the first World Series game ever broadcast on television, ushering baseball into the TV era. In a historic first, on October 5th, President Harry Truman delivered the first televised address from the White House. He used this new platform to ask Americans to conserve food in order to aid European countries that were rebuilding. On October 14th, Air Force test pilot Chuck Yeager became the first person to fly faster than the speed of sound, breaking the sound barrier and becoming the face of fearless flying. On November 2nd, aviation pioneer Howard Hughes piloted his massive plane, Spruce Goose, on its first and only flight, demonstrating the potential of flying large aircraft. Television history was made on November 6th with the debut of Meet the Press, created and hosted by Martha Roundtree. The news show would go on to become the longest-running TV show in American history. By November 24th, the House of Representatives cited the so-called Hollywood 10 for contempt of Congress, escalating tensions over alleged communist influence in the film industry. The following day, on November 25th, Hollywood studios began enforcing a blacklist, denying work to those suspected of communist ties, during a growing period of fear and suspicion. A technological breakthrough occurred on December 23rd, when a team from Bell Labs demonstrated the first transistor, laying the foundation for modern electronics. In closing out the year, on December 27th, the children's television program Howdy Doody made its debut on NBC, becoming an early favorite in the new medium of television. In 1948, the United States was stepping fully into the modern age, with television spreading to all corners of the country. The country's population had ticked up to 146 million people, and Cold War tensions were still rising, with cultural shifts beginning to reshape everyday life, sometimes in ways people didn't even realize at the time. On January 7th, pilot Thomas Mantell crashed his P-51 Mustang fighter plane while pursuing what he believed to be a UFO. This was one of the first widely publicized incidents linking aviation and unexplained aerial phenomena. A tragic accident followed on January 29th, when a plane crash at Los Gatos Creek, California, killed 32 people. Many of them deported farm workers, later memorialized in the song Deportee by Woody Guthrie. On February 21st, NASCAR was officially incorporated, laying the foundation for what would become one of America's most popular and lucrative spectator sports. . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . By March 17th, the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club was founded in California, eventually becoming one of the most infamous biker gangs in the world. On April 1st, scientists Ralph Alpher, Hans Bethe, and George Gamow published work supporting the Big Bang Theory, offering a groundbreaking explanation for the origin of the universe. On April 3rd, the radio program Louisiana Hayride premiered. The program would go on to launch the careers of future stars, including a young Elvis Presley. Television took another step forward on April 19th, when the American Broadcasting Company, or ABC, began its broadcast operations, expanding the reach of the rapidly growing medium. By April 20th, New York City doubled its subway fare from 5 cents to 10 cents, a sign of post-war economic changes affecting everyday commuters. On May 3rd, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against Paramount Pictures and other major studios in a landmark antitrust case, forcing them to sell their theater chains and opening the door to independent filmmakers. History was made on May 14th, when David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the establishment of Israel, creating the first Jewish state in nearly 2,000 years. Israel was immediately recognized by the US and USSR. On June 8th, Texaco Star Theater premiered on NBC, helping make Milton Berle one of television's first major stars. During the Republican National Convention on June 24th, Thomas E. Dewey was nominated for president, setting the stage for one of the most surprising elections in U.S. history. Beginning on June 26th, the Berlin airlift saw American and British planes deliver vital supplies to West Berlin after a Soviet blockade. This became a defining early moment of the Cold War. On July 9th, baseball legend Satchel Paige made his major league debut with the Cleveland Indians at age 42, finally proving his talent on the biggest stage after years in the Negro League. By July 20th, President Harry Truman reinstated the military draft, requiring millions of men to register amid rising tensions with the Soviet Union. Just days later, on July 26th, Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially ending racial segregation in the U.S. Armed Forces. On August 16th, baseball icon Babe Ruth died of cancer in New York City. There was an outpouring of grief as thousands lined up to pay their respects. Television and politics intersected on August 25th, when the House of Un-American Activities Committee held its first televised hearing, bringing fears of communism directly into American living rooms. By September 13th, Margaret Chase Smith was elected to the Senate, becoming the first woman to serve in both houses of Congress. On October 30th, a deadly smog event in Donora, Pennsylvania, killed 20 people and sickened thousands. This drew national attention to air pollution and public health. The disaster was caused by hydrogen fluoride and sulfur dioxide emissions from U.S. Steel's Donora Zinc Works plant, which coincided with an air temperature inversion event. In one of the biggest political upsets ever, on November 2nd, Harry Truman defeated Thomas Dewey, despite widespread predictions of his loss. This was famously captured by the incorrect headline, "Dewey defeats Truman." And closing out the year, on December 28th, the United States announced plans to study launching an Earth satellite, an early step toward the space race that would soon follow. By 1949, the United States population had started to boom, reaching roughly 149 million people. The Cold War was no longer just a theory, it was real. At the same time, television, music, and pop culture were rapidly reshaping everyday life in new ways. This is the year 1949. On January 5th, President Harry Truman introduced his domestic agenda, known as the Fair Deal, aiming to expand Social Security, raise the minimum wage, and improve housing and civil rights. By January 25th, the first ever Emmy Awards ceremony took place in Hollywood. The awards were created to celebrate excellence in the still new medium of television. On February 2nd, golf champion Ben Hogan was seriously injured in a near-fatal car accident near Van Horn, Texas. The crash would threaten his career, but ultimately lead to one of the greatest comebacks in sports history. A strange story captured national attention on February 22nd, when Grady the cow became stuck inside a silo in Yukon, Oklahoma. This turned into a nationwide media sensation, with the cow eventually being freed 3 days later. On March 1st, heavyweight boxing legend Joe Louis officially retired, ending his dominant career that included 25 successful title defenses over the course of 12 years as the champ. This is the longest reign as a champion of any boxer in history. The very next day, on March 2nd, the B-50 Superfortress, dubbed Lucky Lady 2, completed the first non-stop around-the-world flight, refueling mid-air and proving the growing reach of modern aviation. By March 30th, actor Robert Mitchum was released from a prison farm after serving 50 days for marijuana possession, a scandal that briefly shook Hollywood. On March 31st, RCA first introduced the 45 RPM record, a durable and affordable format that helped revolutionize the music industry. A major global alliance was formed on April 4th, when the United States and 11 other nations established NATO, creating a unified front against Soviet expansion during the Cold War. On May 12th, the Soviet Union lifted its blockade of West Berlin after nearly a year of tension and a massive Allied airlift. By May 27th, a 22-year-old Marilyn Monroe posed for a nude photograph that would later become iconic. It would also nearly derail her early career. She was paid just $50, but the photo would go on to be used in the very first issue of Playboy magazine. An unusual personal stunt began on May 31st, when Charlie Lupica climbed onto a small platform atop a 60-foot pole, vowing to stay there until the Cleveland Indians won the pennant. He remained there for 117 days before giving up and coming down. On June 8th, George Orwell published 1984, a novel that introduced the world to Big Brother. Television continued to evolve on June 24th with the debut of Hopalong Cassidy. This show is widely considered the first TV Western series. On August 3rd, the Basketball Association of America and the National Basketball League merged to form the National Basketball Association, creating the foundation for the modern NBA. On August 16th, Gone with the Wind novelist Margaret Mitchell died from injuries she sustained from being hit by a car as she crossed Peachtree Street in Atlanta as she was walking to the movie theater. A major shock came on September 23rd when President Truman announced that the Soviet Union had successfully detonated an atomic bomb, accelerating the nuclear arms race. On September 26th, the modern Hollywood sign replaced the original sign that said Hollywoodland. This new sign would become a landmark and an American icon. On October 26th, President Truman signed legislation raising the federal minimum wage from 40 cents to 75 cents an hour, reflecting post-war economic changes. By November 25th, Gene Autry's version of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer hit the charts, quickly becoming a holiday classic. The song was adapted from a poem written by a Montgomery Ward copywriter named Robert May. On December 25th, one of the first television adaptations of A Christmas Carol aired. The low-budget 30-minute production was narrated by Vincent Price and also included a 9-year-old named Jill St. John, playing one of the Cratchit daughters. 1950, the year that began the golden age of America, a time when the country felt full of promise and families began to grow, pushing the population over 150 million. The new suburbs were popping up, and for many Americans, life felt simpler and more optimistic than it had in years. These are the events of the year 1950. On January 17th, one of the most daring heists in American history unfolded when 11 men pulled off the Great Brinks robbery in Boston. In just minutes, they stole over $2 million from an armored car facility, leaving behind very few clues and baffling investigators for years. President Harry Truman made a public announcement on January 31st in support for developing the hydrogen bomb. This marked a major escalation in the Cold War, signaling that the United States was moving toward even more powerful nuclear weapons. An era came to an end on February 1st, when Curly Lambeau stepped down after 31 seasons with the Green Bay Packers. As the team's founder, coach, and a player, he helped shape the early identity of the NFL. On February 9th, Senator Joe McCarthy claimed that more than 200 communists were working inside the U.S. State Department. His statement intensified fears of communist infiltration and helped launch the Red Scare. On February 13th, a U.S. Air Force bomber carrying an atomic weapon was lost off the coast of Canada. This became the very first recorded Broken Arrow nuclear incident. Walt Disney released Cinderella on February 15th. This film would help rescue the studio financially and become one of its most beloved animated classics of all time. On February 16th, television history was made with the debut of What's My Line? The show featured celebrity panelists trying to guess contestants' occupations, and it became one of TV's longest-running hits. March 6th introduced us to a strange new toy called Silly Putty. Originally discovered by accident, it quickly became a nationwide sensation thanks to its ability to bounce, stretch, and even lift ink from newspapers. On March 14th, the FBI launched its first 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list. This new program was designed to enlist the public's help in capturing dangerous criminals across the country. L. Ron Hubbard published Dianetics, The Modern Science of Mental Health, on May 9th. The book quickly gained attention, presenting controversial ideas about the human mind, and forming the foundation of what would later become Scientology. On May 13th, a major financial shift began when Diners Club introduced the very first charge card. For the first time, people could pay for things using something other than cash. On June 25th, the Korean War officially began when North Korea forces invaded South Korea. Within days, the United States was drawn into a rapidly escalating conflict. On August 10th, the film Sunset Boulevard premiered in New York City. The film offered a dark, haunting look at Hollywood fame, and remains one of the most acclaimed movies ever made. ABC began airing Saturday morning children's shows on August 19th. The show's Animal Clinic and Acrobat Ranch helped establish the idea of weekend TV programming, specifically for kids. On August 22nd, Althea Gibson broke barriers by becoming the first black competitor in a U.S. national tennis championship, paving the way for future generations in professional tennis. On September 4th, the comic strip Beetle Bailey debuted in newspapers. It followed the lazy but lovable Private Beetle Bailey and became a long-running part of American pop culture. The Hank McCune Show introduced a new television technique on September 9th. That's when the first laugh track was used, becoming a standard feature in sitcoms for decades to come. Cartoonist Charles Schulz published the very first Peanuts strip on October 2nd. It introduced the world to Charlie Brown, Snoopy, and a cast of characters that would become cultural icons. On October 12th, the George Burns and Gracie Allen Show premiered on CBS. The show brought classic vaudeville-style comedy into American living rooms. On October 31st, Earl Lloyd made history as the first African American to play in an NBA game, breaking an important racial barrier in professional basketball. An assassination attempt on President Harry Truman took place on November 1st. The attack occurred while the president was staying at Blair House, while the White House was under renovation. Two Puerto Rican nationalists attacked and shot a White House police officer before they themselves were shot by security, preventing the assassination. On November 8th, during the Korean War, American F-80 pilots engaged in the first jet-to-jet dogfight in history with a pair of North Korean MiG-15s. This marked a new era of aerial warfare. On November 22nd, Shirley Temple The #1 box office draw in the late 1930s, announced her retirement from Hollywood at just 22 years old. This ended one of the most famous child acting careers in history. November 24th was the start of the Great Appalachian Storm. It brought devastating snow, freezing temperatures, and widespread destruction across the northeastern United States, killing more than 300 people. On November 30th, President Truman warned that the United States might use atomic weapons in response to the escalating tensions in the Korean War. And finally, on December 13th, a young actor named James Dean appeared in a Pepsi commercial. It was a small role at the time, but it became the start of a career that would later define a generation. Recollection Road and LEGACYBOX both believe it's important to preserve the past. If you're like me, there's a box of your family's treasured home movies and photos tucked away somewhere, and LEGACYBOX can help you preserve them digitally. The process is a simple and safe solution for converting your home movies and photos to thumb drive or to the cloud. Just send in your LEGACYBOX filled with old VHS and camcorder tapes, film reels, and pictures, and get back digital copies that can be easily enjoyed, shared, and kept organized. It's that easy. LEGACYBOX is trusted by over 1 million people, and it's all done right here in the USA. Get started preserving your past today. Go to LEGACYBOX.com/recollection to get an incredible 55% off. Buy today to take advantage of this exclusive offer and send in your memories when you're ready. Go to LEGACYBOX.com/recollection to save 55% while supplies last. Let me know in the comments if I missed anything, and make sure to check the description of this video for links to pick up a t-shirt. Thank you to our loyal Patreon supporters listed here. Visit patreon.com/recollectionroad to join the club.